Hello everyone, my name is Chris Mang and here's my partner to introduce the project.
The Rana Plaza Collapse by Chris Mang and Joseph Bustos for our FIPT 104 group project. On April 24, 2013 in Bangladesh, a building structural failure incident took place that is considered to be one of the worst in history. That incident is widely known as the Rana Plaza Collapse.
So the incident itself was the Rana Plaza incident in Bangladesh, also known as the Bangladesh factory collapse, as per our instructions. The incident itself happened on April 24th, 2013, and the building at the time contained various clothing factories, some shops, as well as a bank. It seemed like there was also some residential use for the structure. And overall, the incident itself can be pointed to poor building safety standards and enforcement, as well as the ordering of workers to work despite the signs of danger, which ultimately worsened the disaster. So here's an image of the building itself. Note the general structure and how it looked, and of course this was prior to the collapse. And the building itself was called Rana Plaza, built roughly 7 years prior to the collapse, and there was roughly 5,000 total people employed. The clothing factory manufacturers often dealt with Western fashion, which did become relevant later on. The head of the Bangladesh Fire Service and Civil Defense noted that the building's top 3 or 4 floors were constructed without a permit, and the reason for the 3 or 4 is because the 9th floor was actually under construction near around the time of the collapse. As a whole, the enforcement of building codes was extremely lax, which was one of the major reasons why the structural failure happened.
The building did not have proper permits for its upper floors and was not designed for factory use. The architect responsible for the design of the building stated that he was asked to design a commercial shopping mall with 3 or 4 stories for a market, and the upper 2 stories were for offices. He also stated that if he would have known the building was going to be used for industrial use, he would have considered additional measures in the design. The danger of the building was only amplified by the generators on the roof, as well as a sewing machine from the factory that created dangerous vibrations.
The building itself was also built on a large filled-in pond, of which roughly 60% of the structure was built upon. And so this compromises structural stability, as usually these types of lands are less able to handle the strain that a large building like this would pose onto it. And likewise too, the construction material used to create the structure was often subpar and often used sand, cement, and concrete without any iron reinforcements, and where there was, it was usually very thin and too thin to ultimately withstand the forces that would be required of it. Subpar construction materials was one of the major reasons for its collapse, as it would have made the overall structure less able to handle the weight demands. Note the image, which describes more in detail some of the things that we were mentioning earlier, as well as giving a general illustration. So one day prior to the collapse of the building, it became clear that there were serious cracks up and along the Rana Plaza structure, and this actually led to the initial evacuations of various shops and the bank itself on the lower floor. However, the main manager of the factories threatened to punish workers who refused to come into work tomorrow by withholding roughly a month's worth of pay. And despite the cracks all along the structure, the managers claimed that it was safe to return and conduct work. So on the day of the incident itself, it was ultimately traced to the generators on the top of the roof, which kicked in after a power outage and created serious vibrations which compromised the structural integrity. By the end of it all, only the ground floor was intact after the collapse, and this would be classified as a non-fire collapse as there was no reported fire at the incident. And so ultimately it started with a column near the southwest corner, 7th floor, and triggered what was essentially a chain reaction, pushing all those things down and ultimately knocking down all the floors. So the first people there to respond were actually garment workers and nearby volunteers who often were using makeshift bamboo and fabric bolts to pull survivors out of the collapsed floor, and casualties were roughly 3,000 total. Eventually, the fire brigade came to help with official search and rescue. And so here is another schematic which better illustrates the Rana Plaza specifically collapsing and what that looked like. And here's an image of some of the first people there. So in the aftermath, the government began reviewing regulations as a result of the disaster and took more steps to push for enforcement. So this included flagging thousands of factories, shutting down several, as well as conducting more investigations into factory safety. And likewise, as mentioned earlier, the Western clients of these factories formed an alliance called the Alliance for Bangladesh Worker Safety, which also did their own investigations into the factories and pushed for the code enforcement. However, recent reviews show that ultimately these regulations are arguably not enough and not really happening at a fast rate. The changes have been slow, and some claim to describe it as subpar.